It was a warm day in the city, the kind of day where the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the bustling streets. The air hummed with the sounds of busy traffic, hurried footsteps, and the occasional shout of a street vendor selling everything from fresh fruit to trinkets. But in the middle of it all, a moment of pure stillness lingered, unnoticed by most. A young boy, no older than 11 or 12, sat at the edge of the sidewalk. His clothes were tattered, his face covered in dirt, and his eyes had a hollow look to them, like a boy who had seen too much of life's harshness in too little time. He was a beggar, but there was something different about him, something that drew attention. A few steps away, a well-dressed man in a crisp, expensive suit walked down the street, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He was a billionaire. His name was Richard Hartman, the owner of one of the largest tech companies in the world. Despite his wealth and success, there was something about him that seemed restless, almost lost, as though he were searching for something that could never be found. Richard had been walking for hours, his mind consumed by the latest business deal that seemed to slip through his fingers no matter how hard he tried to grip it. He had everything, a luxurious penthouse, private jets, an endless supply of money, but for some reason, he felt emptier than ever. As he passed the boy on the sidewalk, he didn't even glance in his direction. He had seen beggars before countless times and had long ago stopped noticing them. But today, something made him stop. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't eat that." Richard froze. He turned toward the boy, who was still sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on him. "Excuse me?" Richard asked, his tone a mix of confusion and curiosity. The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand, pointing to a small food cart nearby. The vendor, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, was handing out steaming hot bowls of soup to a line of people. Richard hadn't noticed it before, but his stomach growled involuntarily as the scent of the soup reached him. It smelled delicious, rich, hearty, and comforting. "You don't know what's in that soup," the boy said, his voice low and urgent. Richard blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" "It's just soup." The boy shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you, don't eat it. It's poison." Richard chuckled, assuming the boy was just another street kid making wild claims for attention. "Poison? Really?" The boy's face remained serious, his eyes locked onto Richard's as if daring him to dismiss him again. "I've seen it happen before. They get people like you, rich people, to buy it. They mix something in it. You won't even feel it at first, but it's there. You'll die slowly over time." Richard took a step back, his heart suddenly racing. The boy's words didn't make sense. Poison? Who would want to poison anyone with something as simple as soup? But as he stood there, something strange happened. His eyes wandered over to the food cart again, and for the first time, he really looked at it. The vendor smiled at him as she ladled the soup into a bowl for another customer. There was something about her smile that made Richard uneasy, something too practiced, too perfect. His mind raced with a dozen questions, but the strangest part was how his gut twisted in a way he couldn't explain. "I think you should move along," Richard said, trying to shake off the growing unease. "You're making up stories." The boy didn't move. He simply stared at Richard, his gaze intense. "I'm not lying," he said. "I've seen it happen. Not just to one person, but many. You won't believe it until it's too late. And then you'll wish you had listened to me." Richard was about to turn away when a sharp pain shot through his chest. It was sudden, unexpected, like a tight band around his heart. He gasped, clutching at his chest, but the pain quickly dissipated, leaving him breathless, but otherwise unharmed. "Are you okay, sir?" a passerby asked, looking concerned. Richard nodded quickly, brushing it off as if it were nothing more than a passing discomfort. But deep down, a small seed of doubt began to grow. The boy's warning, his words, the way they had made his heart race, it all seemed to add up to something he couldn't quite grasp. Richard glanced at the food cart once more. He could almost taste the soup in the air, its rich aroma teasing him. "I should go," he muttered to himself, trying to move past the nagging feeling in his stomach. But the boy called out to him again. "Don't walk away. You don't understand. You can't just ignore it." Richard hesitated. The boy's desperate tone stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he wondered if he should listen, if he should just walk away from the cart, find something else to eat. But what if it was all just nonsense? What if he was overreacting? With a dismissive shake of his head, Richard continued walking. The boy's voice faded behind him, but not the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He tried to push it aside, to focus on something else, but the discomfort lingered, gnawing at him. Minutes later, Richard found himself standing in front of the food cart. He had no idea why he had come back, but something about the whole situation tugged at him. The vendor smiled brightly as he approached. "Good choice, sir. A bowl of my finest soup." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "I'll take one." The vendor quickly handed him a steaming bowl, the rich aroma filling his senses. Richard looked down at it, his appetite suddenly lost to the voice of the boy in his mind. "Poison," the boy had said. The words echoed, refusing to let go. He lifted the spoon to his lips, but before he could take a bite, a flash of movement caught his eye. The boy, the beggar, was running toward him, his face flushed with desperation. "Don't eat it, please," the boy shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. Richard froze, the spoon still hovering inches from his mouth. The boy was panting as he reached Richard, his eyes wide with fear. "Why should I believe you?" Richard asked, his voice shaky. "What do you know about this?" The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I know enough. I've seen what happens to people who eat it. They don't realize it at first, but it gets them, slowly. And by the time they understand, it's too late." Richard's hand trembled, the spoon clattering into the bowl. His eyes darted to the vendor, who was watching him with that same eerie smile. It felt as though the whole world had gone still, as though the air had thickened with tension. "Don't you see," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the first person they've tried this on. They've done it before. They target people like you, people with power, people who don't question the small things. They'll never let you see it coming." Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down at the soup, his mind racing. Could it be true? Could the boy be telling the truth? The vendor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Richard felt the chill of doubt settle in his bones. He couldn't explain why, but everything inside him screamed that something was wrong. He pushed the bowl away, his stomach suddenly twisted in knots. "Get away from me," Richard said to the vendor, his voice sharp. The vendor's smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Richard thought he saw something flicker behind them, a glimmer of malice, of something far more sinister. He didn't wait to find out more. He turned and sprinted away from the cart, away from the boy, his heart racing in his chest. As he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just avoided something terrible, something that might have cost him everything. But what if he had made the wrong choice? What if he had just walked away from the one warning that could have saved his life? And in the silence of his thoughts, Richard heard the boy's voice one last time, faint but clear. "I told you so." Richard's legs burned as he ran through the crowded streets, pushing past pedestrians who barely noticed his frantic pace. The city around him was a blur, a cacophony of honking cars, raised voices, and the constant hum of life going on without pause. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a thunderclap in his ears. He didn't know why he was running. Maybe it was the boy's warning, or the nagging feeling that he had narrowly escaped something. But with each step, that feeling only deepened. His mind was a storm of thoughts. Could it really be true? Poison in the soup? Richard, a man who had built his empire on logic, numbers, and precision, found it hard to digest such an outlandish claim. Yet the boy's face haunted him. The fear in his eyes had been genuine. Not the pleading of someone trying to earn sympathy, but the raw desperation of someone trying to stop a tragedy from unfolding. And there was the vendor, the way her smile flickered for that split second, the look in her eyes that had been more than just a friendly gesture. What had it meant? Was she complicit in something? Or had he been overthinking it all? Richard didn't know how far he had run before he found himself in a quieter part of the city. The streets here were narrower, the buildings taller and older, their facades weathered by time. He slowed down, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he couldn't shake the image of the boy's face, nor the disturbing thought that something might have been terribly wrong with that soup. He needed to get out of his head, clear his mind, but his thoughts kept swirling back to that moment. Why had the boy been so adamant? Why had he tried so hard to stop him from eating? He leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch his breath. A cold sweat had broken out on his forehead, and his hands shook slightly. The world around him felt oddly distant, like he was no longer a part of it, but merely watching from the sidelines. Focus, he muttered to himself, forcing his thoughts to slow down. Focus on what you know, what makes sense. He tried to rationalize the situation, to explain away the boy's words as nothing more than a street kid's attempt to garner attention. But every time he went down that road, something tugged at him, urging him to reconsider. There was too much that didn't add up. Why had he felt such an overwhelming sense of danger, like something had been calling out to him, warning him? Richard had never believed in the supernatural or in gut feelings that defied reason. He had always relied on his intellect, his ability to analyze and understand every situation. Yet now, in this moment, his mind was a jumbled mess of uncertainty. His eyes drifted back to the street ahead, watching as people went about their day, oblivious to the turmoil inside him. He was just another person in the crowd, but he didn't feel like it. He felt different. Something had shifted in him, something profound, yet he couldn't grasp it. Richard's thoughts returned to the boy. He couldn't get the image of his face out of his mind. The boy had said that he had seen it happen before. But what was it? Was he referring to the poison in the soup? Or was there something else at play here? Richard didn't know enough about the boy to understand if his words were credible. He didn't know if the kid had any idea what he was talking about, or if he was simply making things up. And yet, the boy had seemed so sure, so utterly convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Richard pushed himself off the lamppost, his mind made up. He wasn't going to let the boy's warning go unheeded. He had already come too close to making a mistake, and he wasn't about to make the same one again. He would go back, find out the truth for himself. It didn't take long for Richard to retrace his steps. He passed by the bustling streets again, the familiar sounds of the city filling his ears. But this time, his senses were heightened. His gaze scanned every detail around him, the people, the cars, the street vendors. He noticed things he hadn't before, things that seemed out of place. Was it paranoia? Or was something truly off? When he reached the food cart again, he stood a few feet away, watching from the shadows. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, not yet. His eyes were locked on the vendor, who was still serving customers, her smile unwavering, her demeanor as cheerful as before. But Richard saw something new now. It was subtle, but there was a tension in her posture, a stiffness in the way she moved. She didn't seem as friendly as she had before. She seemed guarded. Richard couldn't explain it, but there was an air of calculation about her. His gaze shifted to the boy. He was no longer sitting on the sidewalk. Instead, he was standing against a nearby wall, watching the cart with intense focus. The boy's eyes met Richard's for just a moment, and in that brief exchange, Richard felt an undeniable sense of urgency. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an overwhelming need to talk to the boy. He needed answers. The boy's warning was too much to ignore. He walked toward the boy slowly, trying not to draw attention to himself. When he was close enough, he stopped and waited for the boy to acknowledge him. The boy didn't look up at first, but after a moment, their eyes met again. "Why did you try to stop me?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy seemed to hesitate, his eyes flickering with a mix of wariness and something else, something deeper, almost like a burden. After a long pause, the boy spoke. "Because I've seen it," he said quietly. "I've seen what happens to people who trust them. They don't just poison you physically, they take something from you. Something inside. It's worse than death. They make you feel empty, hollow. You can't ever get it back." Richard took a step closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What do they take?" The boy's eyes darkened. "They take your soul. They feed off it. And once they've got it, they own you. Forever." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The boy's words were cryptic, but there was an eerie sincerity in his tone that made Richard uneasy. He couldn't dismiss the boy's warning anymore, not after hearing that. "What happens to the people who eat the soup?" Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. The boy looked away, his face shadowed with sorrow. "They don't just get sick. They change. They become different. Like they're not even human anymore. I've seen it happen. You can't recognize them. Their eyes are vacant, like they're not really there. It's like something inside them has died." Richard stared at the boy, trying to process what he was saying. The whole situation seemed increasingly absurd, but the boy's words had an unsettling ring of truth to them. Richard had no answers, only more questions. Before he could speak, the vendor's voice rang out from the food cart, cutting through the tension. "Everything okay, sir? You still want the soup?" Richard's heart raced. The moment of confrontation had arrived. He glanced at the vendor and saw that her smile was still there, but this time it was different. It didn't reach her eyes. The warmth had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Richard swallowed hard. He had to make a choice. He turned away from the boy and took a few steps toward the cart. "No," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I've changed my mind." The vendor's smile faltered for a split second, but it quickly returned. "Very well, sir. But I'll be here if you change your mind." Richard didn't wait to respond. He turned on his heel and walked away, the weight of the boy's warning still heavy on his chest. But as he walked, a thought lingered, nagging at him. Had he made the right choice? Had he just walked away from something dangerous? Or had he been tricked into leaving behind something he didn't understand? And as he walked deeper into the city, the question gnawed at him. Would he ever truly know the truth? Richard's footsteps echoed as he walked further into the heart of the city, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. The boy's warning, those haunting words, stuck with him like a shadow, following him, creeping into every thought. Had I made the right decision? The question looped through his mind over and over, each time with more urgency. There was something about that soup, about the vendor, that felt off. But how could he trust a child who had nothing but vague, cryptic warnings to offer? Yet every part of him told him that something had been wrong, something was still wrong. But what? Richard's steps slowed, his senses heightened. The air felt denser now, as if the city itself was pressing in on him, constricting him with its weight. He glanced up at the towering buildings that loomed above, their glass facades reflecting the overcast sky. The streets were still crowded, but everything seemed distant, as if the world was moving in slow motion, while he stood at the center of it all, out of place. He felt as though he had stepped into a different world, one where logic no longer had a place, and everything was seen through a lens of uncertainty. The warning kept replaying in his head. They don't just poison you physically, they take something from you. The words haunted him, an unsettling mantra that echoed like a drumbeat. What could he mean by that? The soup seemed ordinary enough, nothing special about it. Yet, the more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed that he'd been so quick to dismiss the boy's warning. Had he been blinded by his own arrogance? Was it his wealth, his success, his status that had clouded his judgment? He stopped in his tracks, suddenly gripped by a cold realization. The boy had warned him for a reason. Why did the boy care enough to warn me? In his mind, the pieces slowly started to form an unsettling picture. The boy, despite his rough exterior, had spoken with an intensity that suggested a deeper knowledge. He was no mere street kid. Had he known something Richard didn't? Had he seen things, been exposed to things that Richard couldn't even begin to understand? Richard found himself standing in front of a small, nondescript cafe. He hadn't meant to come here, but somehow his legs had carried him. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the door, and for a moment it was a small comfort. He needed to clear his head, to think, but he knew he couldn't do it in the chaos of the street. He pushed open the door and entered, greeted by the warmth of the interior and the hum of quiet conversations. The cafe was cozy, tucked away from the outside world, offering a strange sense of solitude amidst the bustle of the city. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. His thoughts were a maze, each twist and turn leading him back to the same place, the boy and his warning. What was really in that soup? The more Richard thought about it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just food. It was a transaction, a contract. He could feel it now. Something dark had been lurking just beneath the surface of that simple transaction, and he had almost fallen victim to it. His mind raced, seeking a way out, but every thought only led to more questions. What if the boy wasn't just trying to protect him from poison? What if there was something much darker at play? What if the vendor and others like her were part of something larger? A hidden system of manipulation, an undercurrent of control that Richard had never even suspected. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like he had stumbled into something he shouldn't have, and now he couldn't back out. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, breaking him from his spiral of thoughts. He glanced down, seeing the name of his assistant flash across the screen. He hesitated before answering. For a brief moment, he wondered if this was just another distraction, another part of his old life that no longer seemed relevant in the face of the bizarre events unfolding around him. But with a sigh, he swiped to answer. "Richard," his assistant's voice crackled through the phone. "There's something you need to see." Richard frowned, his interest piqued. "What is it?" he asked, trying to sound calm despite the rising tension in his chest. "There's been a report, something strange. It involves the soup vendor you saw earlier." Richard felt a chill shoot down his spine. "What kind of report?" His assistant paused for a moment before responding. It's hard to explain. You need to come to the office. I'll send the details. But trust me, you won't want to ignore this." Richard didn't need more convincing. He stood up, his coffee forgotten on the table, and left the cafe without a second glance. His mind raced as he walked back to his office, the streets now feeling like an endless maze. What was it that his assistant had found? Was this what he had been searching for, the missing piece of the puzzle? When he arrived at his office, the building felt different. The usual hum of activity seemed muted, like everyone was holding their breath. As he walked down the corridor to his assistant's office, Richard's heart thudded in his chest. He entered the office and found his assistant standing by his desk, a stack of papers spread out before her. "I don't know how to explain this, Richard," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "But we've been tracking the vendor's movements. There's something very strange going on with her, something we can't quite put our finger on." Richard sat down, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" The assistant gestured to the papers. "These are surveillance reports from the last few months. It turns out that this vendor, she's been in the area for years, but there's no record of her previous life. No background. No identity." Richard's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What does that mean? There must be something." "That's the thing," she continued. "There's nothing. It's as if she appeared out of thin air. We've traced her movements, but there's no evidence of where she came from, who she really is. It's like she doesn't even exist in any official records." Richard's mind was racing. This wasn't just about a soup vendor anymore. This was something much bigger, something that didn't make sense, something that couldn't be explained by simple coincidences. "Keep going," he urged. The assistant shuffled through the papers and paused on one report. "We also found this. Someone filed a complaint about her a few weeks ago. It was an anonymous tip, but it's strange. The person said that anyone who ate her soup would be marked by a symbol that wasn't visible at first but would eventually appear on their skin. It's a shape almost like an ancient rune. No one's seen it, but the tipster swore that it's only a matter of time before it shows up. And when it does, She stopped, eyes widening. You're under her control." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind. Under her control. The room felt suddenly suffocating. Was it possible? Had he unknowingly crossed a line he couldn't return from? Had he eaten the soup, sealed his fate, and now there was no turning back? "I think you need to go back there," the assistant said quietly. "Find her and confront her. Whatever this is, you need answers. Fast." Richard stood up abruptly, his mind spinning. Confront her? He didn't know if he was ready for what that might reveal, but there was no other choice. He had to go back, confront the truth before it consumed him. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the puzzle was more terrifying than he could have imagined. There was something dark behind all of this, something that had been lurking beneath the surface, waiting to ensnare him. And as Richard left his office and headed back into the city, he knew that whatever awaited him, it was far worse than he had ever expected. Richard's feet felt heavy as he retraced his steps back to the street where he had first encountered the vendor. The air around him seemed to grow thicker with every step he took, as if the city itself was closing in on him, wrapping him in an invisible web. His thoughts swirled in a disorienting dance of dread and anticipation. The warning the boy had given him, the mysterious reports his assistant had uncovered, everything pointed to one undeniable truth. There was something unnatural about the soup. And whatever it was far from over. As Richard walked down the familiar street, his eyes darted from one corner to another, expecting something to jump out at him. But the world around him seemed eerily normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beneath the surface, waiting to rise. His mind returned to the boy's words. They don't just poison you physically, they take something from you. The words lingered, a dark undertone to his every thought. When he finally reached the alleyway where he had seen the vendor earlier, he noticed something that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The soup stand was gone. The street was silent, the area devoid of the bustling energy that had filled the space only hours earlier. Richard's heart began to race. Had he imagined it? Was it possible that he had been so consumed by the events of the day that he had created the whole encounter in his mind? But as he took a few steps forward, his gaze caught something on the ground, something small, yet unmistakable. It was a single crumpled piece of paper, its edges stained and worn, as though it had been there for much longer than Richard had realized. He bent down and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. His fingers trembled as he read the words scrawled across it. "The mark is already on you. You will never leave this place, not truly. She knows you are coming. It's too late." A wave of panic surged through him. But it wasn't just fear that gripped him now. It was the creeping sensation that he was too late. The boy's warning had been a plea, a desperate attempt to reach him before it was too late, before he was trapped in whatever this was. The soup, the vendor, the symbol, the control. It had all been part of something far more insidious, far more dangerous than Richard had ever imagined. Suddenly, he felt it, a sharp, searing pain on the back of his neck. His hand instinctively shot up to touch it, his fingers brushing against something. Something small, almost imperceptible, but there. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He turned toward the alleyway, but the street was empty. No vendor, no boy, nothing. But the pain lingered, spreading through his body, a reminder that he was now part of something that he couldn't escape. As he stood there, frozen in the middle of the empty street, a thought struck him. He had been warned, and now it was too late. There was no way back from this. The mark on his skin, the mark that had been invisible before, was now the key to everything. He had crossed a threshold, and now, like so many others before him, he would be consumed by whatever dark power held sway over this place. With a final, resigned breath, Richard turned away from the alley, knowing that he had already lost. The city had him now. The game was over, and he was no longer the master of his own fate. His footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the silence of the street, leaving nothing behind but the haunting echo of his own surrender.